Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Isaiah J. Poole. I am the Vice President of Communications at the Democracy Collaborative, and I am super pleased to get us started on the second day of the Post-Capitalism Conference. We have a very exciting panel of three very smart people who we first brought together through a book called The New Systems Reader, Alternatives to a Failed Economy. This was a project that started actually before I joined the Democracy Collaborative in 2018. And it was the brainchild of a person named Gus Speth, who had a long time involvement and engagement in the environmental movement, and learned through his work in the environmental movement that capitalism is not up to the task of saving the planet. It is not up to the task of making sure that all of us have what we need to thrive. It is not up to the task of making sure that we have equality and equity, and we are capable of repairing the damage from the legacy of racism and oppression and marginalization, not only that exists in the United States, but around the world. I have a lot in common with Gus because I too thought that capitalism was that sort of cow that you could sort of milk, and as long as you milk the cow and you could get the milk from the cow, and as long as you fed it right and you didn't agitate it too much, you could keep, you could get the milk and get the benefits, and you won't get stampeded. And it turns out that a whole history of events, culminating perhaps in the 2008 financial crash, but certainly very evident in what we've seen in the past year with the COVID-19 crisis, is that capitalism is a beast that you simply cannot milk and contain. It is a beast that has, that really needs to be replaced with something different and something better. What that something is, and what that something is part of the debate that we're having. And I wanted to bring together three people who are very instrumental in forging new approaches and new ways to think about the economy that should be. I want to start with Emily Kawano. And Emily Kawano is a person whom I've gotten to know through something that we call the Resist and Build convening. She is in charge of something called the Wellspring Cooperative, in which she, if she wants, can take a moment to talk about more completely. But she has been at the forefront of discussions about what a post-capitalist economy should be. After she speaks, we will introduce the rest of the panel, Nia K. Evans, who is with Ujima Boston, and David Korten, who many of you know as one of the founders of Yes Magazine and is a very prolific author and very prolific thinker. All three of them will talk about what they contributed to the New Systems Reader and how it applies to the present moment. So I'm going to start with Emily.
Thank you, Isaiah. It's nice to be here. I have to apologize for not being on camera. I'm just having technical problems. I'm going to talk about solidarity economy, which is an approach that is clearly post-capitalist in its vision. I guess I want to just start by saying that we are in this moment once in a generation, maybe once in 2 generations. We are in this rare moment where there are a number of crises that are converging. So we have obviously the pandemic, all the racial justice uprisings, all the climate change catastrophes that are increasing, and also the worrisome slide towards fascism. We could go on, but those are some of the major ones that are converging. And it's, on the one hand, scary times. On the other hand, it opens up opportunities. It opens up opportunities for a paradigm shift, because people's faith in the current dominant model of capitalism is shaken, even if they don't articulate it like that. There is an opening for new ways of thinking, new ways of thinking about how the economy works, how our society works, etc. So let's see. I'm going to start by saying, what is solidarity economy? Let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, is that full screen for y'all? Okay, great. All right. This is a definition of the solidarity economy. It draws on, if you look in the upper left-hand box, it draws on the definition from the US Solidarity Economy Network and REPES. REPES is the International Solidarity Economy Network. So it's a network of networks in all of the continents, except for Antarctica. REPES embarked on a 2-year international consultation process to clarify the definition of solidarity economy. And while it's a very big tent and it will look pretty different in different places and at different times, here's kind of a foundation that we agree on. So first, solidarity economy, it's a framework. It is a framework that connects solidarity economy practices and people working in the movement and who are practitioners. So the practices and the people are aligned with solidarity economy values. So it's a framework that is really grounded in these values. In the US Solidarity Economy Network, we use these 5. So we talk about solidarity, cooperation, mutualism, etc. Democracy. So not only in the in elections, but in communities, in the workplace, etc. We talk about equity in all dimensions. So race, class, gender, ability, etc. Sustainability is pretty self-explanatory. And the last one is pluralism, which means it's not a one-size-fits-all model. And I think that's very important, because it means that solidarity economy is going to look different places, different political, economic, social, cultural realities, and different, it'll change in time. And it's not a blueprint. We're not dogmatic. And take this all together, this framework and these practices, it articulates a post-capitalist world. So we need to move. If you're working in a solidarity economy framework, you clearly are aligned with the belief that capitalism, as Isaiah said, is not going to get us there to that more just and sustainable world. So solidarity economy is very clear about that perspective. And maybe in discussion, we'll get into why that's so important. Just to mention the global dimensions and give you a sense of that there is a there. It is a global movement. Solidarity economy is a global movement. I already mentioned REPES, the international network. The International Labor Organization puts on an annual Solidarity Economy Academy. The United Nations has a task force on the solidarity economy. Solidarity economy has been enshrined in a couple of constitutions, Bolivia and Ecuador. And there are a number of countries that have national policy frameworks in support of solidarity economy. So this is just gives you a sense of this huge foundation that we have to build on. This is broken into economic sectors. As an economist, this is sort of the way my brain works. There are other ways of depicting this, but anyway, you can see that there are lots and lots and lots of practices that already exist and are already successful that align with those solidarity economy values in every sector of the economy. So again, there's a huge foundation to build on. I do want to point out that some of these are old, right? Co-ops are very old. Mutual aid is ancient. Some are new. Maybe the time banks are relatively new. We can debate about that. Some are mainstream. So I want to particularly point out that like the public sector, right? It's probably a keeper. Some things in the public sector are probably keepers in our other world, right? Public schools, public libraries, national parks, and most likely some forms of regulations, various kinds of public policies. So some of solidarity economy is already very mainstream, and some of it is what might be considered alternative. So I just want to make that point that there's this breadth, and it's not new. The framework is relatively new, but the practices are, many of them are ancient. And what the solidarity economy is trying to do is pull these together. Right now, all of these practices tend to be sundered from each other, and they operate in their own silos, and they're great in and of themselves, but they don't recognize each other as part of the same transformative project. And that's part of what solidarity economy is trying to do. I will leave you with this metaphor about imaginal cells. So when a caterpillar spins a chrysalis, its body starts breaking down into this kind of a goop. And in that goop are these things called imaginal cells. And these imaginal cells have a different vision of what it could be, right? Something different than a caterpillar. But the imaginal cells are seen as foreign bodies. And so they are attacked by what's left of the immune system, and they're killed. But gradually, these imaginal cells start finding each other, and they start clumping, and they're able to resist the attack of the immune system and survive. So as they continue to clump, then they specialize, they start to specialize, and some becomes an eye, and some becomes a wing, and some becomes a leg. And eventually it emerges from the chrysalis as a butterfly, right? That's what they imagined, that this caterpillar could be a butterfly. And I think it's a nice metaphor for solidarity economy. If you think about all those practices in the previous slide, those are like imaginal cells, right? And if we can get these imaginal cells to recognize each other and start clumping, right? Connecting, figuring out how we're building this solidarity economy system, maybe we can pull off this transition from capitalism into a post-capitalist economy, and beyond just economy as traditionally narrowly defined, but it really encompasses how do we manage our household, right? That's the origin of the word. And build a world and a society that works for people and planet, that's just, democratic, sustainable, and cooperative. So I'll stop there. I believe my time is up. Yep.
Well, Emily, thank you very much for that presentation. I want to remind everyone that there will be an opportunity for questions, and what we're encouraging everyone to do is to place questions and comments in the chat box, and we will be following up with those questions after everyone has spoken. I am very excited to present to you Nia K. Evans. She is one of the leaders in Ujima, Boston. She is doing tremendously exciting work around building a more democratic infrastructure in the city of Boston, in which people are actively engaged in shaping the future of their communities. She is a person who has a background in labor relations. She has a background in education and in public policy. And she has also a deep interest in culture and the importance of culture in leading us toward a new economy. So I'd like to talk to her about what she contributed to the New Systems, like her to talk about what she contributed to the New Systems Reader and how it applies to this present moment. Nia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Isaiah, and thank you everyone who is here. Thank you, Post-Capitalism Conference, for inviting Boston Ujima Project to participate in this conversation. Thank you, Emily. Wonderful presentation, beautiful slides. I love the deep blue there. And appreciate following a very well laid out description of what solidarity economy is, which we definitely recognize ourselves as part of the solidarity economy, and part of our work is kind of evangelizing, so to speak, the solidarity economy. And then I just want to say quickly, Isaiah, I get called Nia Long all the time. Fine. She's one of my favorite actors from back in the day. I do not mind at all. I don't mind sharing a first name with her. The next thing I want to say is I did not write the entry in the New Systems Reader by myself. So as with almost everything, if not everything, Ujima, it was a collaborative effort, and it's definitely important for me to point that out. And we actually do take pains when we're doing talks and panels, et cetera, to really point to all of us who are a part of this work, because it is a massive undertaking. It is rather collaborative. So this was actually written with Aaron Tanaka, who's a co-founder of Boston Ujima Project. And I saw David just clap with excitement. I know there are quite a few people in this room who know Aaron, including Emily, and as well as you, Isaiah, and Libby Cohn. And Aaron Tanaka is the director of Center for Economic Democracy, which is Ujima's fiscal sponsor, and Libby Cohn works at Center for Economic Democracy as well. And I definitely see a couple of our members here in the conversation. So I see MJ Lieberman and I see Steve Dubb. Part of the practice is that Ujima is co-created, and so where possible, we definitely try to name all of the names at different levels of this work. So when the three of us, Aaron, Libby, and I were talking about our entry for the New Systems Reader, where we landed was we wanted to center. You might see my cat. Let me just get her out of the way. What we wanted to do was actually center reparations. Which there's been an interesting progression in the reparations conversation, but for us it was important to center reparations. It was important for us to ground the damage of capitalism as we know it, and who we know that it particularly impacts the most, and I'm saying the most for lack of a better word. And for us, it was important to ground reparations not only from a material perspective, but also from a relational perspective. And I would say the relational perspective being even more important. And so we start there with if we're thinking about how inadequate our current system is, and we're thinking about what a next system looks like, then it's important to have as comprehensive a grounding as what makes the current system problematic as possible, and to be clear about what we don't want to take into the next system. And so I'll just read a couple of things that we have here in our entry. And thinking about reparations, again, we said we didn't want to focus just on the material piece. So we say, rather than focusing the debate on the technical viability of calculating payment, which I would like to point out that's only a debate when we're talking about reparations for Black people. So we do know that reparations have been enacted time and time again throughout the history of different nations. It's only with Black Americans that reparations has been seen as a task that's somehow too complex to figure out. But rather than focusing the debate on the technical viability of calculating payment, the reparations movement demands political and cultural space for conversation led by the communities that experience the harm, about how the United States can build the new and reciprocal relationships of repair and accountability necessary to address the continued effects of slavery and to prevent similar harms from being perpetuated. And then we cite, or we note, Movement for Black Lives, which went to great lengths to actually be concrete about principles that underlie reparations and what reparations could look like. So a broader framework for reparations could take various forms. The Movement for Black Lives cites the United Nations guidelines on the right to a remedy and reparation in its own recently published reparations toolkit. And then I just want to highlight number 5, which is guarantees of non-repetition. And so this is just something I want to point out. So in the previous passage, we talk about the continued effects of slavery. And so just really important for us to understand when we think about post-capitalism or a next system, we're not talking about some effects that have stopped at a certain point in time. And we're just dealing with the legacy or the aftermath of those effects. We are talking about what continues. And then again, with guarantees of non-repetition, I think this is a big danger in our work if we are not intentional and deliberate about how we perpetuate these oppressions in our relationships, and how we can very easily carry them into a next system or into a new system. One of the proposals is for the immediate passage of HR 40, among other policy proposals, and we've seen that there's been some recent progress in that area. So historically, the House has finally passed legislation for a commission to study reparations. And again, just pointing out, we're just talking about a commission to study the issue. So this is a level of resistance to repair to Black communities in America. We also take pains to point out, although reparative justice in this venture is rooted primarily in the history of Black liberation struggles in the United States, this work accords with the aims of Indigenous movements for land rights and restitution, as well as intersectional femme and feminist leadership. So definitely important to point that out. And I don't know how much time I have left, but there are just a couple more things that I want to say. And Isaiah, you said this well in your intro and your setup. We focus on a couple of things. So one is practice. So we have a section called Translating Values to Practice, and that's what we think the Ujima Project does. And then the second is the arts and cultural organizing work that we focus on, that we put a lot of time and effort and resources into. Okay, great. I have 2 minutes. So just on the practice piece, and Emily talked about practice as well. We see our work, and definitely this showed up when the pandemic first started, particularly when a shutdown first started, to provide as many opportunities as possible for people to practice everyday activities that would lead us to post-capitalism solidarity economy, what we think is next for us. So we actually started a campaign last year when the pandemic first started called Necessary Systems. And we also think a lot about our framing. And so what we've started to do over the past year and a half, for example, is we've started to move our conversations from things like radical imagination. Not that radical imagination isn't important, but really wanting to take it out of the realm of what seems fanciful or what seems merely dreamy or merely wishful, and into we are actively building this every day. This is real. This is reality. We will win, and we are winning in different ways every day. So just want to emphasize practice and just everyday practice. And then finally, just with arts and cultural organizing, for us, we also hold the perspective that practice allows us to understand what it can look like and what it can feel like. And for us, arts and cultural organizing adds that additional element as well. But it's important for us to understand what it feels like to live differently, and to be able to do more than just imagine, but to be able to actually embrace it as a real possibility, and to know when we've arrived because it's familiar. And so for us, that's where we focus on a lot of arts and cultural organizing work. We use our arts and cultural organizing work to also link back to the past. So Emily said a lot of these ideas are ancient. So we want to make sure that our community members know that. So we think that excavating that history adds to the real possibility. And again, we're not trying to create something completely from scratch. We're not trying to perform magic. What we're doing is we are discovering some ways of being that we've already known, that have been buried, that have been terrorized out of us, and we're combining it with some newer ways, and then we're making sure we do it every single day. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nia. And we're going to be following up with some questions, because, as I said before, there's some really interesting stuff happening in Boston right now. Wanted to point out, this is the book, The New Systems Reader. And if you go to the website, thenewsystemsreader.com, you will be taken to a place where you can find out more information about the book. There's a link that you can use to purchase the book. And currently the book is selling at a 20% discount. So if you buy today, you'll save a little money. Wanted to now turn the floor over to David Korten, who is the founder and president of the Living Economies Forum. He is a co-founder and board member, and in fact was the board chairman emeritus, or is the board chairman emeritus of Yes Magazine. He has served as a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. His books include When Corporations Rule the World, Change the Story, Change the Future, A Living Economy for a Living Earth. Has been a co-chair of the New Economy Working Group. And I have found him to be one of the most insightful writers when it comes to analyzing both the political and economic, but also the underlying social and cultural changes that we are experiencing and need to experience. So I look happy to present to you now David Korten.
So Isaiah, thank you. I am truly delighted to be joining this essential discussion of alternatives to an economy that is not only failing to meet the essential needs of most people, It is, as I think many of us are aware, disrupting Earth's capacity to sustain life and essentially putting us on a path to human self-extinction. Now, fortunately, many of us here recognize that there is an alternative. And this gets us right down to our deepest human nature. We humans, we're a choice-making species. And we can choose to transition to a new civilization that some of us call an ecological civilization, grounded in a series of obvious truths that conventional neoliberal economics either ignores or denies. The thing that gives me hope is that these truths are simple, they are obvious, and they are immediately recognized by most people. We are living beings born of and nurtured by a living Earth. Our well-being depends on Earth's well-being. We are in this together. We cannot eat, drink, or breathe money, and there are no winners on a dead Earth. Imagine an economics that recognized these simple facts. Life, not money, must be our defining value. And cooperation, not competition, must be our defining economic strategy. Now, I covered a lot of ground there, so I want to repeat those words. We are living beings born of and nurtured by a living Earth. Our well-being depends on Earth's well-being. We are in this together. We cannot eat, drink, or breathe money, and there are no winners on a dead Earth. Life, not money, must be our defining value, and cooperation, not competition, must be our defining economic strategy. Everything else is details. I find two statistics sum up our current crisis. According to estimates of the Global Footprint Network, it would require 1.7 Earth planets to sustain the current level of human consumption. Now, as most of you have probably noticed, we have only one Earth. Now, even before COVID-19 shut down much of the economy, most of Earth's people faced a dehumanizing daily struggle to survive, while a tiny minority among us indulged in obscene displays of excess. In January of 2020, the combined wealth of the richest 26 billionaires in this world exceeded that of the poorest half of humanity. That poorest half is 3.9 billion people. Then COVID hit, and the divisions got rapidly worse. During a single year between March 18th, 2020 and March 18th, 2021, the wealth of all the world's billionaires, that's a combined 2,365 individuals as of March 19th, increased by $4 trillion. That was up 54% in 1 year, the year of the crisis. Now, that this occurred during a year of extreme crisis for most people on Earth represents the ultimate economic failure. The deeply flawed economic theory underlying this failure is known technically as neoliberal economics. It is more accurately described as egonomics, because it celebrates a world of egocentric individuals competing to maximize financial fortunes far beyond any conceivable need. Now, this version of economics is a flawed political ideology, not a science. Its claim to legitimacy rests in part on the deeply flawed and increasingly challenged theory of outdated evolutionary biology that told us that evolutionary success depends on ruthless competition. In truth, success does not depend on competition. it ultimately depends on cooperation. And we're beginning to wake up to that reality. Economic theory has an additional flaw. It embraces money as the defining measure of wealth and well-being, ignoring the fact that money is just a number. It can buy only that which is for sale. Real value is created by the labor of living beings, both human and non-human, and we should be rewarding that labor. Yet because we are conditioned to accept money in exchange for the things of real value, money gives those who possess it extraordinary power over those who do not. In our current system, the greatest power goes to those who are skilled in gaming the financial system to gain control of money without producing anything of real value in return. Now, no simple adjustment of the current system will suffice to save us. A viable human future depends on deep transformation guided by a new economics and economics, eco as in ecology, founded on recognition that life exists only in diverse communities of living beings that self-organize to create and maintain the conditions essential to their individual and collective existence and well-being. I am because of the bees that pollinate, the trees that produce oxygen, the beetles that replenish the soil by aiding the decomposition of dead plants, the microbes that digest the food in my gut and recycle my waste, and the people who love and care for me as I love and care for them. Now, without these many diverse beings, each making their contribution to the well-being of the whole, Earth would be just another dead rock floating in space. And I would not be experiencing the miracle of life. This has deep implications for how we define the purpose of the economy, structure the institutions of power, and manage the procreation of the human species. Call them the three P's: purpose, power, and procreation. The purpose of an economy, indeed the purpose of society, is the well-being of living people and the living earth. More specifically, it is to provide all people with material sufficiency and spiritual abundance while supporting the well-being, beauty, and creative unfolding of Earth's community of life. If the economy is achieving this purpose, whether a statistical measure called GDP is growing or shrinking should be irrelevant. Next comes power. For the economy to achieve its intended purpose, power must reside in place-based communities of people committed to the health of their place and the well-being of the people who depend on it, not on transnational corporations dedicated to maximizing profits for the already rich. Now we come to procreation. We must manage the continuing regeneration of the human species to maintain our balance with one another and Earth, while preparing future generations to fulfill the distinctive potentials and responsibilities that come with being human. Life replenishes, renews, and evolves through continuing cycles of conception, birth, maturation, adulthood, death, and rebirth. We must learn to manage our human reproduction to maintain appropriate human balance with Earth's regenerative systems in every place where we live. The human family has more than enough abused and neglected children. What we lack is adequate attention to the care and development of all our children. Imagine a world in which every child is a wanted child and all children are loved and supported by a caring community of people committed to supporting them in actualizing the fullness of their humanity. The disruptions of COVID-19 have exposed with uncommon clarity the dramatic failures of a money-centric economy organized around an ideology of self-centered competition. That exposure helps us to see the imperative to transition to an ecological civilization that recognizes the interdependence of life and the responsibilities that go with our distinctive human ability to choose our common future. This awakening makes the COVID-19 shutdown an unprecedented opportunity to transition to the culture, institutions, technology, and infrastructure of a materially sufficient and spiritually abundant future for all on which a viable human future depends. The choice is ours. The time is now. So back to you, Isaiah.
Wow, that gave us a lot to think about. And so I really thank you, David, for presenting that to us.
Thank you.
I actually, I want to encourage, there's a lot of good discussion happening in the chat box. Please keep that going. Want to make sure that if you have any questions for any of the panelists, please feel to put those forward. I actually want to start with David's point about this being an unprecedented opportunity. And I wanted to get Emily and Nia into that particular piece of conversation because I've been thinking a lot about the mutual aid efforts that have sprung up around the country in response to the COVID-19 crisis, and whether things like that are steps toward building a new consciousness about what is possible, that in fact a post-capitalist economy is something that we can in fact realize. Emily or Nia, would you like to pick up that point?
Sure. Short answer, yes, Isaiah. I think maybe the thing that I want to talk about with regards to mutual aid, and I've said this before in another conversation, and it just reminds me I should probably actually read the article. But what I've said before was I remember there was a headline, and this was in Atlanta. And unfortunately, I cannot remember the incident at this point, but this was an incident involving a police killing, I believe, and there were riots in Atlanta, and so the police force there boycotted. They didn't appreciate their less than stellar public reception. And so the mayor of Atlanta was in a position where to deliver some vital services, she needed to turn to the mutual aid infrastructure that had sprung up in Atlanta. And so, I'm kicking myself because I should just read the article, but I remember seeing that headline and thinking, wow. And this was for sure in the summer of 2020. And so when we think about the fact that the pandemic it's still going, but it has not yet ended, we think maybe one more surge is likely, but not just this pandemic, but a next crisis. So we definitely know there's going to be a next crisis. And so when we think about that capacity that was built up last summer, and to Emily's point, built up from what was pre-existing. So there wasn't necessarily anything new that sprung up, but the moment pushed people into action, and it put us in a situation in which we strengthened what we already had. And so unfortunately, the next crisis is going to do that. But it was really interesting to me to see formal power structures also have to depend on what had been created by mutual aid.
I'll just add something short. Thanks for that example. If you do dig it up, or I can do a search as well, that's a great example. What a great story. Yeah, absolutely. What's the potential of trying to strengthen the mutual aid networks? Many of them were new that sprang up, certainly in Western Mass. I can attest to the fact that it was just like suddenly they just emerged, but they could use. My fear is they will just vanish once this current crisis is over. So yeah, how do we start thinking about that? How do we start thinking about, I think, livelihoods instead of just jobs? And so mutual aid is one way of trying to sustain our collective livelihoods by sharing and helping and producing together community production, or which might be something like a community garden, or it might be something like a cutting edge maker space with like the cutting edge technology, 3D printers and all that kind of stuff, right? So thinking in like that instead of just jobs, I think is really, really important. And it's going to be increasingly important as we move forward into the age of AI and automation, which isn't going anywhere.
Thank you. That actually goes into a question that was just posted in the chat, and it's actually kind of a long question, but the essence of it is that the solidarity economy gives us alternatives, gives workers alternatives to the capitalist system of relying on a paycheck from capitalists. But it doesn't eliminate commodity production, market as the principal means of exchange, et cetera. What do each of you think about how a post-capitalist society would be organized at the macro level? Garo Perovitz, who is the co-founder of the Democracy Collaborative, believes in this idea of a pluralist commonwealth, in which there will be multiple forms of institutions and means of exchange based on needs of communities and based on decisions that people in those communities make. So is that along the lines of how you're thinking, or are there other models that you look at? I know, Emily, you talk about this a lot. And David, I would love for you to weigh in, and Nia, I would love for each of you to weigh in.
Well, I'm happy to jump in here. I want to take this back to what I think is one of the most fundamental variables that we tend to neglect in this conversation. One of the things I've become very conscious of is all the ways in which modern life separates us from one another in nature. And if you think about it, most of what goes on in our economy monetizes our relationships. Now, here's where we have a lot to learn from traditional societies where people lived for thousands of years before they ever got around to creating anything that we recognize as money. And if you understand biology, understand how life organizes, there is nothing in nature that is the equivalent of money, which is essentially a number that we accept as a little chit as a medium of exchange. All relationships in nature are directly between living beings. And in traditional human societies, all the relationships are direct. That is how life organizes. we have allowed money to dehumanize us, to turn us from living beings relating to each other into financial beings who are chasing these little numbers we call money, which puts us totally within the thrall of the people who control the creation and allocation of those numbers. And until we recognize that fact, we will remain captive to money and the people who control our access to money. Now, all of these alternative economic relationships, the deeper I dive into it, the more it becomes clear that the foundation of the change is restoring our direct relationships. And that is one of the things that's been happening as a consequence of COVID-19. That even though we have this social distancing, we've become to appreciate more and more the real relationships, and our exchanges are based more and more on direct relationships, not mediated by money.
David, can I jump in for a second? I love your comment about, nothing else in nature has something called money that it uses to exchange things. On the other hand, I'm talking to you right now through a computer using software that no other creature in creation has the capacity or the means by which to either create this thing, manufacture this thing, or have it in their nest. Mm-hmm. So in your world, given what you've just said about the primacy of human relationships, how do we also have the kinds of things that enable us to have things like technology and machinery and other sorts of things that enable us to live the kinds of lives that we want to live?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. And it comes down to the fundamental question of how do we use technology?
True.
And, this is something that's very meaningful to me because, as many of you know, I spent most of my life living, or not most of it now, but much of my life living outside of the United States in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And when I first moved abroad, our only mode of communicating with home was snail mail. And that takes quite a while. And the fact that now we can instantly be in communication with one another anywhere in the world is a truly extraordinary advance. That is the most breathtaking thing that's happened to humans in our experience. And it creates an enormous potential. But another thing I've been realizing, I have many international colleagues, and we're more and more communicating by Zoom. Wow. 2 years ago, to attend a conference of the Club of Rome, our meeting was in Cape Town, South Africa. Now, I live essentially in Seattle. If you take the globe, there's no place that you could hold an international meeting further from Seattle than in Cape Town. It took virtually 24 hours sitting on an airplane to get there. Now, if you're going to that kind of a conference, you're focused on what you're going to say, not on what you're going to hear from other people. And it's just extraordinary what's happening to our communications as we now meet as international groups. We just sit down at our desk and we connect with Zoom and we communicate like that. Wow. Now imagine a world in which we have direct communications with our neighbors. We have lots of situations where we sit down and we exchange, and we talk to each other, we care about each other. When we want to have an international conference, we go on Zoom, we go bingo. We save an airplane trip, we save days of time. And the magical thing is suddenly we're listening to each other and learning from each other instead of simply getting on an airplane to go talk to each other. And that's the remarkable thing of what we're experiencing right now as well. So it's a matter of learning how we can use these technologies in ways that further humanizes, further connect our conversation at deeper levels to push our common understanding of who we are and what our possibilities are at a depth and speed that has never been contemplated by humans before. That's what we're about right now.
Great. Emily, one of the issues that came up in the discussion, one of the themes has been growth. And I'll be transparent, I've been picking fights with some anti-growth people, not because I disbelieve in their fundamental concern about the planet. I mean, we all heard what David said about how our present model of consumption is literally killing us. But I think we don't have yet a framing of the issue that takes into account, and I'm actually looking forward to be proven wrong. A framing of the issue that takes into the account what is also clear, which is that there are a handful of us who have way, way, way too much, and a whole bunch of us who have way, way, way too little. And that the real issue, at least to me, is that all of us should have what we need in order to survive and thrive. Emily, what's your take on sort of how we should rethink growth in the context of building a new economy?
Oh, thanks, Isaiah. Such a little topic. Well, first of all, I do think do not claim to be an expert in this debate. So just some probably not very deep comments, but I think we need to be thinking about development instead of growth. So if we're thinking about growth, just more stuff, that's one thing, and that's not sustainable. Leaving aside the imbalances, right? Like some countries, rich countries, have way more and way more outsized expectations of how much stuff we should have. Clearly, that has to change. Clearly, there needs to be allowances for countries that are still, they do not have enough. They're poor countries, and they need more stuff. But in general, I think we need to think about development and not just growth. Right. So we as human beings, we finish our growth, I don't know, at the age 20, maybe, but we continue to develop. And that's what we should be focused on. Not all of it is material consumption. I think it is absolutely, once upon a time, I think the degrowth movement there was a kind of crude thing, like just the whole world needs to stop growing. My sense is now it is more nuanced, and there is recognition that it's a huge commitment that the richer countries need to make because they're consuming way more than their fair share. So yeah, that's my somewhat superficial take on that. But can I go back to the question about commodities that I think Rich asked? The thing is, like, producing for sale as opposed to use. It's true, a lot of the practices that we would embrace, say a worker co-op, right? A worker co-op is democratic, and the workers own the means of production. They own the business, but they're still producing a commodity. What I would say is, right, they're in keeping with pluralism. Right? There are some people that really believe that we need to eliminate markets, period. That markets inevitably are going to lead to hierarchies and imbalances and control and injustices. And there are other people that are saying, no, there are ways to tame markets. And so one nice thing about so I don't have an answer to that question. I think it depends who you talk to. Me personally, I think there's a way to tame markets. Markets have existed not only for human beings from time immemorial, but markets to some extent exist in nature as well. There's exchange of take a forest, right? There's an exchange between the trees and the microorganism, the fungi, right? And sometimes there's punishment, right? There is retaliation that happens. So there are these relationships. Anyway, I'll stop that there. I just want to say something about commodities, and there's a range of views.
Yes. Thank you, Emily. I want to move on. Nia, I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about some of the work that you and Ujima Boston have been doing in the city of Boston around changing the way the city works, particularly the relationship between the city government and residents. That sort of gets into sort of participatory budgeting, participatory policy making. If you could talk about that for a minute.
Sure. I guess first thing I should say about that is, and this makes me think of part of Emily's presentation where she talked about the different sectors of the economy and kind of how they're siloed. So the first thing I should say is Ujima was conceived as an ecosystem. And so one of the first things being that these different sectors or parts are very intentionally connected into one system in Boston. And I mentioned that just to say, so one piece of that is the Ujima Fund. And the Ujima Fund is considered the first democratically governed investment fund in the country. And there are a few things that are notable about this fund. So one is investors do not make decisions about what the Ujima Fund invests in. It is actually Ujima members, Ujima voting members, to be very specific, who make those decisions. And a Ujima voting member is simply a resident in the city of Boston proper, ideally identifying as either a working class person or a person of color. And those members have an opportunity to invest in the fund if they want to. So that's the other piece. It's pretty accessible, but they do not have to make a decision. So their decision making about what happens in their city comes by virtue of them being a resident. And so that's one of the ways we've adapted participatory budgeting to our work. And I should, as an aside, say Boston already had a youth participatory budgeting initiative, and Aaron was pretty, integral in kind of bringing that effort to the city. And so I would say this is one of the ways in which we have, as regular people, made this type of decision-making power available to more people beyond youth. And so right now we are in conversations with other different departments of the city. So for example, we're talking with the chief of arts for the city about doing a participatory process for grants to artists in the city. And we're looking to partner up with the city's Office of Resilience and Racial Equity to participate in that effort. And we're going to try our hands at reaching out to the Office of Economic Development to see if they'll participate in that effort. So just in terms of Isaiah, kind of changing the way the city works with communities, so to speak. We're definitely, what's the word? I would say doing the work of taking participatory budgeting. There's a way we've adapted it to the Ujima Fund. And so taking our processes, allowing different officials in the city to know what that is, experience it, practice it, and advocate for participatory budgeting outside of us. So there's a charter reform effort that's underway now that's being led by Center for Economic Democracy, for example. And that charter reform effort is to change the city's charter. And one of the aims of that is to incorporate participatory budgeting as a citywide mechanism. Definitely look to places that have done this already, like New York City, for example. But yeah, just so it's not to be long-winded, I'll stop there. But hopefully that's provided a little bit.
Yeah, that begins to touch on one of the questions in the chat about the kinds of local, state, and federal initiatives that can be done that move us toward an alternative post-capitalist economy, by giving people power to do post-capitalist things, with the money that that is generated in the local economy. Emily, or David, I wonder if you have anything to add to that broader question about how we might move state and the federal government and start nudging them. Let's take, for example, this $2 trillion push right now on infrastructure, for example. Is there an angle in that people in this group should be pursuing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that locally there's an effort to try to capture some of that money. Some of it is already gone, right? They approached their local towns for a transportation co-op. That money is already gone, right? So some of that American recovery money, it's coming down fast. It's already spoken for. But yeah, there's a lot of investment, right? All the infrastructure investment. There's a lot of stuff that's coming down. None of it is earmarked for solidarity economy. So in thinking about the money that's coming down the pipeline for universal childcare, can we get a foot in the door to push for some of that to come to childcare cooperatives? Or when we're thinking about energy production, can we think about pushing for community-owned energy production? Sector by sector, there's various areas that I think we could be pushing on policy. We developed this through this resistant build process. We did develop a candidate questionnaire that maybe we can put in the chat. It's there for use by anyone on a local level or whatever, statewide level or federal level. So it's just pressing elected officials about where do you stand on, let's see, public, and David Kopp, you might have to help me out on this, public banking, worker cooperatives, community land trusts, community-owned energy, and I'm blanking on one. Anyway, there was a fifth. And I'll try to find it and drop it in the chat.
All right, thank you.
I'd comment on, just one of the most foundational pieces relating to infrastructure. Part of what separates us relationally is, in fact, our dependence on cars. And it's, this was part of an experience of living in New York City, which is one of the few cities in the United States where you've really got to be out of your mind if you have a car. And it was just extraordinary. The most everything we needed in daily life, we could walk to within a few blocks of our front door. And if we needed to go further, we had a wonderful public transportation system. So absolutely no need for a car. Now, if you live in Los Angeles or you live in Houston, if you don't have a car for every member of the family, you are totally isolated. You're simply stuck. This is a fundamental question of infrastructure. Now, this infrastructure package is an extraordinary opportunity to begin to ask, how do we redo our infrastructure in ways that eliminates our dependence on cars? This is all part of thinking more deeply. Now, I also want to bring in here this whole discussion of GDP. If you understand GDP, the main thing that it measures is the monetization of relationships. If you have a traditional village in which people grow their own food and they exchange things among themselves, they take care of each other and they don't make any use of the official currency, their GDP is zero and they are absolutely poor. But as certain of our studies that we have demonstrate, they may be living very well. They may be healthy. They may be very happy. They have strong families. They have a strong community that cares about each other, but they've got no GDP. So this is also part of, does GDP need to grow or not? No, the question is, what is the foundation of well-being? It's why I like the frame of a well-being economy and the issue of what are the indicators of the performance of a well-being economy. So just a couple of other issues that come in here.
David, while we've got your attention, one of our questioners asked a question that I think you, David, since you've been in the communications business, would be well equipped to answer. And that is, how helpful is it actually for us to be talking about capitalism as we build a new economic paradigm? How important is it? I think, there's let's face it, there's a reason this conference is called, or there might be a reason why this conference is called the Post-Capitalism Conference as opposed to the Anti-Capitalism Conference or the Pro-Something Else Conference, So how do we message this so that we are actually getting people on board with us?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. And the biggest danger here is that if you focus on capitalism, what's the alternative to capitalism? Well, most of us would say socialism or communism, but we are not talking about a move from corporate control to big government control. We are talking about a movement to community control. Now, this gets into the issue, you may have heard of Adam Smith, the economist, and supposedly the economist of capitalism. But if you really actually read Adam Smith, his market economy was a farmer's market, which would be totally like our community our community markets that we're talking about. And his idea, he was absolute passionately against corporate monopolies. And he was very distrustful of any business that was larger than one person. So when he's talking about ownership of business, he's talking about very small enterprises. And I think everything we're talking about is not a move from big business to big government. It is from big business and from big government to community. But of course, the government has to be accountable to the communities. It has to be a truly democratic government, but it has to be setting rules that strengthen community control and our ability within our own communities to adapt to our local situations. I mean, the way we organize our local economy, our local food and so forth is going to be very different if we live in the Arctic or in a tropical area, or we live in areas of prairies or forests or wetlands or oceanfront. The local decision-making has to be adapted to our local situation, as several of you have mentioned. So that doesn't fit with any of our kind of established ideological or well-understood political models. I don't know, we might call it communitarianism, but that's got a bunch of traps too. So I kind of just like to use the word the well-being economy. Also, of course, like to use the terms living economy for a living earth, or living economy for living people on a living earth.
Right.
Can I answer that question?
Yeah, Nia, please go ahead.
Oh, and I think Emily, you wanted
Yeah,
to
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, so I think, I think what I want to add to that is I would say, sure, it's okay to talk about capitalism. I think for me, it's less what the word is or what the term is, and it's more about the how. And it's more about how accessible the conversation is. And when I'm talking about an accessible conversation, I'm not talking about jargon. I actually think jargon's okay, and I actually think it's great for people to learn new words, and I think we can learn new words, and so I think that's fine. But when I say accessibility, I really mean in terms of where the conversation is. And where people can place themselves in a conversation. And I think one of the reasons that I would say it's okay, I think it's important to give people permission to question and examine, and I think that is what a good conversation does. So I think one of the biggest and this has come up a couple of times already, and it's definitely a phrase that we talk about in a wider conversation, this notion of there is no alternative, for example. And so I think the way that we battle this notion of there is no alternative, or this is a natural state of being as opposed to a creative one, is we generate conversations that give people permission and the place to actually question that and to understand it as something, as David said, that is a choice, and to say, so the conversation we're having and that all of us should be having is what are the different choices? Let's talk about the different choices that are possible. And then just finally, the last thing with regards to accessibility, I think often, and we talk about this at Ujima, and I'm on the board of Center for Economic Democracy, so we talk about it there. I think often about how our conversation either connects with or does not connect with. I think it mostly does not connect with conversations that everyone else is having. And so again, to me, that is where we move from this sense of, is this really possible to actually a bunch of people see themselves in it and it's possible, which is where are we placing these conversations? How are we placing them in front of regular people? How are we connecting the conversations to what they are already talking about?
Yeah, I'm going to jump in on the importance of being able to talk about capitalism and post-capitalism and having clarity about that. So the big danger about not having clarity about what is capitalism and what is post-capitalism is that if you don't have clarity, it's pretty likely that good things, well-intentioned things, will end up reforming capitalism and very likely strengthening capitalism. So a good example is the New Deal, right? The New Deal platform was really stolen from the socialist and communist parties at the time, coming out of the Great Depression and then World War II, right? And it was taken in by the status quo, and it really still the restless waters, right? There was a lot of radical organizing looking to change the system, but it got taken up, right? It got taken up in the service of capitalism, and it completely saved capitalism. And so that's my worry, if we don't really have clarity about what is capitalism and what is post-capitalism. And so, for example, like I'm totally critical of neoliberalism. Absolutely. I'm with you, David Korten. Absolutely. But I'm also critical of other forms of capitalism, like New Deal capitalism. And in my way of thinking about it, even social democracy like Scandinavia, certainly lots of great things about it. I'm not opposed to it, but I also think we can do better, right? As a species, I think we can do better because even in Scandinavia, corporations are still very much in control of the economy. And inevitably what happens, right, we've seen New Deal capitalism, a kinder, gentler, markets were more tame, corporations were more regulated, et cetera, et cetera. And what happens is the capitalists will keep trying to break those chains. And they did. And then we had neoliberalism, this kind of cutthroat, brutal, bare-knuckled form of capitalism. And that will keep happening because the fundamental intrinsic logic of capitalism is grounded in one, right, this class struggle between the owners and the workers, right? So there's this inevitable class conflict. And I don't care how many kind and caring capitalists there are in the world, which I absolutely believe there are. But the system, the overall system powerfully drives towards ever more accumulation and growth and big corporations. And that is ultimately also unsustainable environmentally. I think at the heart of it, because of that class struggle, the capitalist always needs divide and rule. And therefore it's going to use race, it's going to use gender, and it's going to use any other kind of divide that it can build on. So there are things that are baked into capitalism, and we're a long way from Adam Smith and our economy being mostly made up of small businesses, right? Like the power of the big corporations is a reality. That's just a reality right now. I just think there are any number of reasons from equity perspective, from a environmental perspective, from a human dignity and welfare perspective. Capitalism has contradictions that will never really get us there to this more just and sustainable world. So I think it's really worth it. It's really worth it to have these discussions. I know there's a lot of fear about having these discussions because it'll be divisive. Part of the whole resist and build initiative was to prove to ourselves that we could convene national organizations working on system change across a spectrum. Some were full-on solidarity economy, some were, mixed, right? They had people in their circles that are all about reform capitalism. And I really feel like we were able to model that well. We had a good, civil, productive conversation. And for some people, it was like a light bulb going off saying, I see why that's important. So I just think I can't stress how important I think it is, especially for people at this level, to be grappling with and have clarity. And it's not to throw stones, right? I feel like, look, if some people really, really believe that we can reform capitalism and get there, fine, that's one position. I'm not going to knock you, right? But that's not solidarity economy. And I disagree, right? And we can disagree and still have civil, constructive conversations.
To be clear, I'm not defending capitalism or saying we need to reform capitalism. I think you and I think, are basically saying the same thing, that where we need to go, regardless of what we call it, is beyond big government and beyond big business to community as the center of control and power, which involves people controlling the assets on which their own living depends. I think we're all basically totally on the same page on that basic frame.
We only have thank you, David. We only have 5 minutes left, and we have actually more questions that we could bring up in this session, including the question of, is the Green Party going to win the next election? Don't know. don't know what the answer to that question might be. But I think there's a question that builds on that, and I'd like each of you to take 1 minute, just 1 minute, to close on this note. And that is, what do we do from here to get to the point where we could really have a decisive political turn toward a post-capitalist world? Who wants to start that?
Well, I'll jump in there. To me, the foundation is basically very simple, which is to recognize that we are living beings, not financial beings. And as soon as you get clear on the nature of life and our needs and responsibilities as living beings, you come to a wholly different framing of what the purpose of the economy is and how we need to organize it. So That would be my answer. Recognize we are living beings.
And Nia, let me ask you, is there something we can decisively do either in the area of culture or in the area of politics, or in the area of civics that we should start to do now to make that happen?
I think, thank you, Isaiah. I think I may partially answer your question and maybe just partially say just something I just want to say. So
Okay.
just to let you know,
as long as it's in 1 minute.
Yeah, just to let you know, I may or may not answer your question. So I want to go back to reparations. So I think I'm just still thinking about the conversation David, Emily, and I just had about capitalism and you know, we could definitely talk about it some more, because for sure, and I think Emily is pointing this out, I would say, for example, there are ways the three of us would probably have a similar page, or a similar frame, but there would be some marked differences. So, for example, I found myself thinking just about racial capitalism, which is something that our team is just getting more grounded in, and just kind of noting the absence of that, for example, in this conversation. And so, yeah. I'll leave it there. I think kind of, you know, I think there's a tendency on this side of the work to paper over differences that actually do matter, and to kind of turn those differences into nothing. So I think we need to stop doing that. Is what I would say to start with.
Okay, Emily, you have the last word. 1 minute.
Yeah, I'd be hard pressed to say that there's one critical thing. I think that the times are so critical, and we're in this like such a dire moment. We need just to fire on all cylinders, right? And so all that work. I mean, I'm totally happy. People that are working on capitalist reforms, I'm happy that that's happening. That's better than nothing, right? I just choose to put my energies elsewhere, but it all needs to happen, and it is happening. I mean, there is an amazing groundswell of organizing around solidarity economy and joining up solidarity economy with social movements. I mean, even like it is kind of creeping into the mainstream. You can see ways for better or worse. It might be kind of scary, but foundations are starting to get interested, and they're exploring solidarity economy. It's making more inroads into the academy. Yeah, and in every sector there's growth, and it's being taken up, and there's more policies that are being introduced. So look around you, and it's happening. And you know, the simplest thing that you could do to support solidarity economy, one is just recognize all the ways in your life that it exists. For example, non-waged care work. So we all probably engage in caring for our kids, or caring for our parents, or volunteering and helping, you know, in the community, or caring for a neighbor. This is all valuable economic work, even if it's not waged. So there are a million ways that we are all engaging in solidarity economy out of caring and mutuality and cooperation. Recognize that. And the other thing is, for solidarity economy, even just mentioning it is useful, because it creates this echo chamber. And even if somebody doesn't know what it is, it's like, oh, what is that? And it's an opening. And you say, oh, it's, you know, however you're messaging it, right? Whatever works. So
I want to thank our panelists, Emily Kawano, Nia K. Evans, and David Korten, for talking about our failed economic system and the alternatives that are in front of us. Thank you all very much. Again, The New Systems Reader is the book that they have all contributed to. You can get it at thenewsystemsreader.com. Thank you all very much.